Columbia University. He's lectured widely all over the world and written over 50 articles, 2 major books, and has contributed as editor to 5 other volumes. His interest is on philosophical questions concerning free will and the emergence of brain and behavior, and notions of moral responsibility and freedom. But today this is his own title choice, I should say. Breaking with tradition. He's been to many Faraday courses, but today he's going to ask us the question if there's a complete explanation of everything.
Thank you. Right. I was struck during the question comment that Ted made in the earlier session, where he started to say, you know, you have to get, you're getting into metaphysics there, and I wanted to object to, but you say that like it's a bad thing. Okay. So we're going to get metaphysical here. Okay, so the world is a complicated place. Natural science, and especially fundamental science, brings some unity to the blooming and buzzing confusion of ordinary observation. But it still involves a lot of particular detail, as Rodney was emphasizing. The specific mass and charge of electrons, for example, the number of them, the size and structure of space-time, and lots of other things. Whichever way you look at it, it doesn't seem to be necessary that things be just the way they are. I might have been a roofer, like my father, instead of a philosopher. And there might have been schmectrons, that's just a term I've made up, instead of electrons, as among the basic building blocks of physical reality. There seems to be, once you start imagining, there seems to be no end to the way things might have been, as opposed to the one complete way that things are, including the past and future. The world, as philosophers, so this is just a philosopher's term of art, the world seems contingent, such that they might have been otherwise, rather than necessary, such that things had to be that way. Science is about the business of trying to explain how things actually are at a deep level and how they behave. That is, it proposes and ever refines accounts of the world's structure and its dynamics. At first glance, it seems that something necessarily will be left over, unaccounted for in principle by scientific theories. The fact that things in general are as they are, that there happens to be a world of the sort that we find and that the sciences aim to better understand. There is undeniably in all of us a powerful impetus to ask the question, why is there this? Where this is supposed to encompass everything that's spatiotemporally connected to ourselves, however big that might be. Why is there this? Why indeed is there anything at all? Question that Leibniz answered or addressed famously in an essay. But perhaps you relate less to the great philosopher and polymath Leibniz than you do to the American filmmaker and comedian Woody Allen, who said, "I'm astounded by people who want to know the universe, but it's hard enough to find your way around China." Yet a little reflection shows that a satisfactory answer to the question of why this would require an altogether different kind of explanation from familiar sorts in science and in everyday life. Would any sort manage to do? If so, would more than one? These are really big and long debated questions in philosophy and sometimes in science. I recently wrote a whole book addressing these issues, and one reviewer complained that the book was far too short. So you'll be relieved to hear that I am fully aware that my time this morning is very short, and my aims are accordingly modest. First, I will provide a simple and compelling reason for thinking that an explanation of contingent existence itself is something that empirical science cannot aspire to. Second, I will try to delineate the schematic form that a successful explanation, one that necessarily transcends science, would need to take. if there were to be available such an explanation? What will be the form of explanation? Third, I will respond to just one, but very popular argument that, if successful, would bring the whole discussion to a screeching halt. It is an argument that purports to show that it is impossible that these questions could have a constructive answer, or at least an answer other than one that would be too crazy to take seriously. I will try to show that the argument is mistaken and that we can learn something important about the nature of explanation by seeing that this is so. As a result, we'll see, fourthly, how to ask and how not to ask the central question concerning contingent existence. The one positive claim that I will defend here is that classical theism has the materials for a viable candidate explanation of existence. If you want to consider it in an argument that it enables the best possible explanation, you'll have to read my book, which is helpfully out on the book table. All right. Complete or ultimate explanation is not to be found in empirical science, I'm going to try to argue. Ultimate explanation of contingent reality, the sum total of all the existing objects and their histories that might not have been, would be an explanation that involves no brute givens, and it leaves no explanatory loose ends whatsoever. It would be such that one could not intelligibly ask for anything more. All true, more limited explanations would rest on something that not only has no further explanation, but can have no further explanation. I will argue that no foundational physical theory can aspire to explanation of this sort by considering, in broad outline, three main ways that one might try to pull it off, showing why these ways cannot succeed, no matter how much the world cooperates, and suggesting that the lesson generalizes. So consider first what we may call the way of eternity. That is, the attempt to provide an adequate theory on which physical reality has no beginning, whether of finite or infinite temporal measure. Every stage, every moment of time is fixed by what has gone before. So there's an explanation in terms of the prior stage of physical reality. And the totality of physical reality is just the sum total of all those stages, and there's no beginning. The way of eternity is instantiated by a generalized Newtonian theory of infinite space and time, by the more recent physicist John Wheeler's theory of oscillating universes, where the Big Bang is followed, the universe expands to a certain point and then begins to contract, and then there's the Big Crunch. Whether you call it the Big Bang or the Big Crunch depends on which side of it you're standing on. If you're looking ahead, it's the Big Crunch. If you're on the other side, it's the Big Bang, right? Sorry, I lost my place here. Or by any theory on which our universe is itself generated by some primordial physical universe generator, itself beginningless or spawned by a sequence of structures that has no beginning. I'm a philosopher, so I'm open to any of these ideas, realizing that not all of them have the same measure of empirical evidence on current information. But I'm not here to adjudicate empirical issues. That's not my job description. I'm just interested in the whole class of theories that take this form, that says there is no beginning to physical reality. And some think that if this is so, if we have empirical evidence that this is so, then in principle we could see how there could be ultimate or complete explanation that's purely immanent to the physical world. Okay? So that's one way, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but I want to talk about a couple of other ways you might think you could provide complete explanation. So the second way is what I'm calling the way of unification. This is the attempt successively to reduce physical theory's number of fundamental properties and property bearers, and the number and complexity of the laws governing their coevolution throughout space-time. This way's theoretical limit is just a single simple equation governing the distribution of a single fundamental entity, right? Imagine the most reductionistic picture. We get down to a single kind of exotic entity, and it's governed by a single, very relatively simple dynamical law, and that's it, right? This would realize physicist Steven Weinberg's dream of an equation that our descendants might display on their t-shirts so that it could be statable even by posterity's most unreflective teenagers. With maximal unification, it suggests, comes maximal explicability. So if we could realize this limit case scenario, that would provide complete explanation. That's the suggestion. Finally, the way of plenitude, which was broached in Rodney's talk earlier. This is the attempt to provide complete explanation, not by burrowing down to the fundaments of physical reality or pushing back in time, but by spreading out, doing in some sense just the reverse. Satisfyingly complete explanation may be achieved, it is claimed, through the devising of an elegant and empirically adequate theory that locates our universe within a vast structure of totalities that as a structure, total structure, exhibits completely non-arbitrary properties. All right, so the thought is, our universe may have a lot of seemingly arbitrary properties, certain particle ratios, and certain things being just so, but if we imagine it's just one instance of a kind of an ensemble of universes, maybe the properties of that ensemble as a whole don't look so arbitrary anymore. This might be a plenum of disjoint island universes, right? Just totally discrete multi-universes. Or instead, it could be causally non-interacting n-dimensional spacetimes embedded within a single hyperspace of n+1 dimensions. Right? So you got, and that's very hard to picture, but anyway, I'll not say anything more about that. This way's limit case would involve the existence of all mathematically consistent totalities, all possible universes, including every hyperspace configuration, as MIT physicist and closet metaphysician Max Tegmark proposes. There's an interview with him online where he says, really, I'm a metaphysician. I just work in a physics department. But he does endorse this idea, I believe sincerely, that every mathematically consistent universe exists. He also says much more darkly, and I had an opportunity to ask him about this once at a conference, that in some sense, universes are mathematical entities, abstract entities. And I was scratching my head. Surely you don't mean that. I can't make any sense of that. And he insisted, no, he really did believe that. But never mind that. So one might go further, of course, and combine the eternity idea, the idea of beginninglessness and unification, though neither seems to square with plenitude, as universes with a beginning, or which are less than ideally unified, would seem to be part of any robust plenitude. So you've got to go one way or the other there. All right, suppose first that some version of the way of eternity were correct. There's no beginning to physical reality. Some have thought that if this were so, there would be nothing left unexplained. That is, unexplainable in principle. I need to stop right now and make sure we're clear. We're limited beings, right? And we're not in a position, perhaps we'll never be in a position, to state even a complete physical theory. But when I'm talking about complete explanation, I mean whether in principle such an explanation is there to be had, whether reality is such that if you were in a position, if you didn't have the computational limits that we do, or whatever other limits we might have that might keep us from being able to state and verify the theory of everything, but still that it's there to be had in principle, right? So we're kind of being like Plato here, right? As philosophers, we imagine ourselves hovering over the surface of the universe and imagining there is an explanation there, right? In principle, to be had. That's the question we really have. Whether or not we'll be able to give that explanation, that's a different question. So the 18th century Scottish philosopher, David Hume, very famous philosopher, famous among other things for his attacks on philosophical arguments for theism in his work, The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. Hume contended that a beginningless sequence of events may admit of a complete, purely internal explanation, even if each of its constituent events is a contingent being, such that it might not have existed. all that is needed, Hume thought, is that each stage of the beginningless sequence has a causal explanation in terms of that which preceded it, right? So Hume's idea is just, well, look, you say, why are things as they are right now? Let's just think in Newtonian terms, absolute time, right? Right now, in the universe, here we are sitting here, many of you with furrowed brows trying to figure out what I'm talking about here. Well, there's an explanation in principle for all that in terms of, you're having walked into this room and chosen to subject yourself to the ruminations of a metaphysician and so forth, right? So you understand, so there's an explanation for why what's going on right now is happening in terms of the way things were just a few moments ago, okay? Even again, if we're not in a position to state that, because we can't track all the variables that influence that, but in principle, it's there to be had. And then you say, yeah, but what about that prior moment? And Hume says, well, if that was explained by what went before it, and provided there's no first moment, right, then we don't have any problems, right? It's just everything's explained by what went before, and so it's complete, right? Everything gets explained, and yet we could suppose that things might have been altogether otherwise. So we have complete explanation, contingency, and we don't have to appeal to anything outside of the sequence of physical events. That was Hume's argument. That there can be imminent stepwise explanations in terms of prior stages for particular events is hardly news, of course. The crucial claim here is that the aggregation of explanations of this kind, if you just sum total all those what would have to be infinitely many individual explanations into an aggregation, then it would be complete, leaving nothing further to be explained. This claim, I argue, is patently mistaken. A complete explanation would be unconditional. It would not appeal to factors that are themselves left unexplained. And this requirement evidently is not met for local sequential explanations where one event is explained in terms of another, which itself is an unexplained given in terms of the explanation at hand. Okay? First of all, let me say, this is not to say that there's anything wrong with conditional stepwise scientific explanations. I'm merely pointing out that such explanations do not aspire to what would be required for Hume's contention to go through. So here's a simple example that illustrates the essential explanatory incompleteness of simply noting stepwise dependence within a beginningless sequence of events. All right, so that was the best image I could grab off the internet last night of a cannonball firing. And of course, along the x-axis, this is supposed to measure distance or something, but let's just have that measure time, okay? And so the 0 on the x-axis, we'll call that time t0. Let's call where it has d, time t1. All right. So what do we have? We have a cannon. We're supposed it's fired at noon, time t0, at precisely the strike, at some instant noon. We'll just idealize, think of it as an instantaneous event. And the cannonball lands at exactly 12:01. Okay. Now consider the infinite sequence of events. That's just a minute of time. But consider the infinite sequence of momentary events spanning all the times between the two events, excluding the first moment, but including the final moment at which the cannonball lands. Okay? This you can't see. I also grabbed this off the internet. This has got an open circle here and a closed one here. It's supposed to be, you're supposed to think of this as an open interval. We're going to just exclude the very first instant. So every moment leading up to that instant, but not including the limit point itself at which the cannon is fired. Okay? And then the idea is start working your way back. There's infinitely many momentary events, right? Because we think of space and time as continuous, even within this short temporal duration, right? Halfway, 3/4, 7, you can keep going, and you'll never get to the limit case, right? You can have an infinite sequence. Very familiar point, right? Thus, though the entire sequence has a finite duration, it still meets Hume's envisioned scenario of a beginningless infinite sequence of events, each causally dependent on events that preceded it. So the trajectory of the cannonball, why is it where it is, in the sky, having the momentum that it does? Well, that's to be explained by where it was previously, other local events. and so on. But because I'm deliberately excluding the first moment, right, the moment at which the cannonball is fired, as we work our way back, we don't get to a first moment, right? And so there's always, no matter how close you get, you get in, you can always, there's a prior stage. And it's causal dependency of one stage on what has gone before. Now Hume should conclude that this series is explanatorily complete, where you exclude the actual firing of the cannonball itself. But this is obviously false. The entire sequence of events has a partial explanation in terms of an event external to the sequence, namely the firing of the cannon at noon, which itself had an explanation, right? So the point being, here you can construct an infinite sequence of events where every stage is causally dependent on what went before, and yet there can be explanation. It can be incomplete, right? One might object that in the scenario Hume envisions, in which the infinite sequence constituting the universe's history also has infinite temporal duration. It's not just a minute of time, but it has infinite temporal duration. There is a reason to think there that the explanation is complete. For unlike in the temporally finite sequence involving the cannonball, there could not be an event temporally prior to the temporally infinite sequence that might play an explanatory role in it. This in turn suggests that there is no room for an explanation of it, which is a pretty good reason to conclude that it is explanatorily complete. However, this sort of response makes a big assumption that is unmotivated, namely that there cannot be either an atemporal or a synchronic causal explanation. It seems possible that there could be a causal agent or condition outside the infinite sequence itself, but not temporally prior to it, that is either always or timelessly giving being to the series. There is reason then to suppose that further explanation is possible even in the case of a universe of infinite temporal duration. Or for that matter, connecting to something Rodney spoke about this morning, in a case of the universe as being finite but with no boundary point, as in the Hartle-Hawking model that was discussed this morning. The same point applies there. We still can imagine either an atemporal or even indeed a temporal but synchronous cause of such an unbounded but finite universe. If so, and if our universe truly is contingent, such that it might have been otherwise, the obtaining of some fundamental facts or other will be unexplained within empirical theory, whatever the topological structure of contingent reality. An infinite regress of beings in or outside the spatio-temporal universe cannot forestall such a result. All right, we might hope to be able to conjoin eternity with the way of unification. But even supposing that an eternal physical reality that is maximally simple at the fundamental level in terms of its ontology, its dynamics, its topological structure, complete explanation would still elude our grasp. A world that is cooperatively simple at its fundamental level reduces the number of contingent facts that need independent explanation. But in the end, what we get is conditional in character. The most fundamental fact of existence itself, the fact that there is anything answering to the simple equation, will necessarily be left unexplained. Hewing only to such a theory, complete explanation would elude our grasp. The same basic problem confronts the way of plenitude. There undeniably is, to my mind, Rodney being the scientist, he's not so happy about this, but to the metaphysician's mind and to metaphysician wannabes like Max Tegmark, there's an elegance, a lack of arbitrariness in the hypothesis that every mathematically consistent universe exists. I find it a very beautiful idea. Such a so-called multiverse scenario, it readily appeals to a foundational theorist of a certain cast of mind, I guess, whether physical or metaphysical. But if it is a fact that there is this vast plenum of physical totalities, and ours is just one in an ocean of such universes, and our reasons for embracing it are wholly empirical, I won't get into whether there could be empirical verification. This is a disputed issue in cosmology. But then we must suppose the remarkable fact to be contingent. It's just the way things happen to be among the ever so many less elegant alternatives. It just happens that there is a multiverse, right? There might have been no multiverse. Or there might have been a less complete multiverse. That would be very ugly, right? Just gaps in the space of possibility, just kind of a random selection. Or there might have been just 17 universes, right? Or maybe a single universe of an arbitrary type, such as ours. That the plenitudinous multiverse exists at all will not then have an unconditional explanation. We could still say, yeah, but why that? Why was this what was realized rather than these seemingly possible alternatives? So, this is a famous science cartoon. Cosmology marches on, right? The ancient human asks, where did it all come from? And now the astronomer with the giant telescope asks, where did it all come from? Right? So, we can advance in our understanding of physical reality, but this fundamental question of existence is just outside the scope of physical science. All right, I conclude that if we seek an ultimate explanation of existence, we must pass from physics to metaphysics. And that's really not so bad. Okay. How should one proceed? Suppose you're willing to kind of go walk down the metaphysical garden path. How should one proceed in constructing and evaluating possible metaphysical answers then to existence questions, the why this question? First thing I want to say is, I want to emphasize, I just kind of threw this slide in here, we're not here doing God of the gaps theology, right? We're not doing, when we're asking this question, we're not saying, okay, here's something science doesn't seem to understand currently, so let's see if we can find a way to, let's say that God did it, right? Because this is something I've argued, and I could argue at greater length, we could talk about this in the discussion, that in principle science can't address this kind of question. It has to take something as given, existence itself, right? And then it can proceed to do amazing work on that given, right, by unifying that given and explaining the structure and dynamics of that given, right? But why there is physical reality to begin with is not something science could do. So we're not doing God of the gaps theology. We're asking a question that is not in even possible competition with scientific theorizing, but it's complementary to it, right? And this fits with Thomas Aquinas' way saying that when we're doing natural theology, we should think of God not as the cause of this or that, as opposed to some other things that God has nothing to do with, but God is the cause of causes, right? He's the cause, the primary cause that lies behind all causes, individual causes in the physical universe. Okay, we'll get there in a moment. So a good place to start, if we're saying, well, what are the possibilities then? If science can't help us with this question, what would an answer look like? A good place to start is to distinguish between explanations, properly speaking, and explanation schemas that specify a mere broad outline of the relevant features of a cause and its manner of operation. Okay? That distinction drawn, we should recognize we could have reason to endorse a general explanation schema, or recipe for an explanation, even in the absence of an explanation, a detailed explanation that fills in the missing details, provided the schema seems to provide the only or the best form of answer as measured by material adequacy and other standards of theory comparison. So note that evolutionary theory offers for many untraceable historical events deep in natural history that we have no access to, an explanatory schema or recipe, though a quite rich one to be sure, right? If the broad outlines of contemporary evolutionary theory are correct, it entails that there are, in principle, available true detailed explanations of a certain type for ever so many specific facts of natural history most of which explanations are unavailable to us. We can't give them because we just don't have the details, right? We don't have evidence of very specific events that happened, say, 500 million years ago, right, in some part of the globe. But the idea is, in principle, right, if you had enough information, that explanation is there to be had in terms of this schema, this framework, form of explanation, right? So schematic explanation is not worthless, even though you can't fill in the details. It seems that if there is to be complete or ultimate explanation at all, there must be a kind of being having necessary existence, whether physical reality itself, as Spinoza held, and as Einstein was very influenced by the philosopher, 17th century Jewish philosopher Spinoza, and Einstein seemed to be attracted to this idea that somehow, in some sense, the universe had to be. Or it would be had by one or more maximally unified transcendent causes of physical reality. That wasn't an omission there. Of course, that's just a little joke. It's kind of hard to come up with a picture to capture that philosophical idea. So the difference between contingent and any necessary beings, it would be an intrinsic and fundamental difference. The one class will include natures that are self-existing, whereas those in the other class would be inherently, ontologically, and explanatorily incomplete in themselves, existing, if at all, in dependency on other things and ultimately on a necessary being. And I take it, right, we ordinarily assume, you and I, we're all contingent beings, right? Our existence depends on the existence of our parents, who might not have existed, who might not have met, and so on. And the same is true for other features of the universe. It seems like our universe is shot through with contingency. Everything in our universe is an inherently dependent being, right? We depend on both conditions for our coming to be, because we have a beginning, right, and also on our continuing to be. Things like there being enough oxygen in this room, and there not being a meteor about to strike in this approximate location, and so on. Now consider the maximally general hypothesis. This is the kind of hypothesis that a metaphysician comes up with as opposed to a physicist. The totality that is the physical universe is metaphysically contingent, while being a timeless causal product of a being that exists of absolute necessity. There's my theory, okay? This is not much of a possible explanation of the universe, since it tells us nothing about the manner by which and circumstances in which the necessary being gave rise to it. It's as schematic of an explanation as you could possibly have. We might take a step towards giving the claim a little more specificity by saying that the necessary being is impersonal, and so blindly and inevitably emanated the universe of necessity. If this were so, the universe itself would turn out to be derivatively necessary, though not intrinsically necessary. So that's one possibility. Alternatively, we could suppose that the necessary being generated the universe through some kind of internal non-deterministic mechanism. I'm going to say a little bit more about indeterminism versus determinism. Sorry, I realize it, but we'll get to that in a moment, right? This is a kind of mechanism such that given all the conditions present at the moment of its operation, more than one outcome was possible. That would be non-deterministic. As opposed to a mechanism such that if you specify all the inputs, it yields exactly one output, okay? So on this second idea, the idea would be any number of possible universes could have been generated by this impersonal necessary being. It operates in a chancy, non-deterministic fashion, and our universe is just the one that happened to have been spewed out. Thirdly, we might say instead that the necessary being is a personal agent whose actions are guided by purposes, right? It caused the universe in accordance with some goal or set of goals. This option subdivides into two possibilities. On the first, the totality of the being's goals and beliefs rendered it inevitable that it would give rise to, to a universe of just this sort, which perfectly reflects these goals. That's what Leibniz thought, famously, right? He thought that ours is the best of all possible worlds. When God considers all the possibilities, he balances various considerations against each other. Leibniz, being the metaphysician that he was, thought that God would really be looking at the kind of overall elegance of the universe and look to have the maximal variety that came out of the greatest possible underlying unity, right? That would be, the most beautiful thing, infinite variety. And Leibniz thought he could achieve this by infinite descent and different things going on at different levels of deconstruction and so forth. And Leibniz thought there would be a best possible universe because you'd have to balance off good-making features against each other, and it'd be like solving for the value of a curve in calculus, which Leibniz, of course, and that's what happens. You invent a tool, and then you want to put it to use in other contexts. Leibniz thought, there would be an optimal value, and that would be the best, right, from this purely metaphysical point of view. And so God, being infinitely wise, of course would choose the best. If there is a best, that's what God would go for. So even though our universe is the product of a purposive being, it turns out that our universe is, in some sense, inevitable. Now, Leibniz struggled with this because Leibniz was a devout Christian, and it sounds like he's saying everything exists of absolute necessity. He tried to fudge this matter by talking about, well, it's moral necessity, not metaphysical necessity. But he sure looks like he's got a very necessitarian picture going on here. God inevitably, yes, God has it within his power to generate ugly universes. There are less, but inevitably God's going to go for the best one. Okay, so you might suppose that. Or you might suppose, on the second version of that, sorry, this isn't terribly readable, I should have chosen a different colored font. You might say that this personal necessary being, its reasons were resistible. Perhaps it has a plurality of things it would find good, and these goods are incommensurable with each other, right? Or there are many, perhaps infinitely many, equally good ways of achieving the same general goal, right? And so he simply, simply chooses, okay? This is, of course, accords with the more common theistic view on which God's creative choice was free. While these explanatory schema are slightly more informative than the initial bare-bones thesis given there in 1, that a necessary being caused contingent reality, they are still, again, far from full explanations. They tell us very little about the nature of the necessary being or its manner of activity. And there are other similarly sketchy possibilities beside. And again, we could try to follow Spinoza and perhaps Einstein in thinking that appearances to the contrary, the universe itself is a self-contained, wholly necessary being, down to the last, most contingent seeming fact. So for Spinoza, okay, let's see if I can find one here. So a little sort of scuff right here on the table. Spinoza would say that there was that scuff on that table at just this moment in history was absolutely necessary. Could not possibly have been otherwise, because it's a necessary being, all of whose details are necessarily the way they are. I won't talk about Spinoza now, but that's a possible route you could go if you're wanting an explanation why this. Spinoza would say, why this? It had to be. It only appears like it could have been otherwise due to our ignorance of the details. If we could really see the universe subspecies eternitatis, from a God's eye point of view, we would see that everything exists of absolute necessity, right? So it's an imminent, but that's a metaphysical claim. That's not an empirical scientific claim. Or we might enrich the multiverse hypotheses with the metaphysical, not empirical thesis that the existence of the multiverse itself is necessary. Though all these explanations are only schematic, and indeed highly schematic, it's important, again, to see that we might have reason to embrace a particular one of them, even if precious few additional details are forthcoming. And we're probably not going to be able to come up with many more details, right, when we're theorizing metaphysically. We could add a few bells and whistles to all these possibilities. I won't bore you with the details, but it's only going to go so far. It's not going to look anything like quantum mechanics, or we're not going to get equations or that sort of thing, and we're certainly not going to get empirical kinds of details that can be put to the test. But we still might have reason to embrace a particular one of these explanatory schemas if one of them seemed to work on reflection and not generate insoluble puzzles of its own. We had weighty reasons to think that each of the alternatives we could envision either implode on examination, they end up being incoherent when you really examine them, or they face grave problems for which there are no clear remedies. That would be less decisive, but still would give us some reason for rejecting them. And finally, there's reason to think that the alternatives we had considered are exhaustive. Even absent the assumption of exhaustiveness, we would have some reason to adopt the favored view, albeit with less confidence, right? In science, no one supposes that when some theory is favored that we've considered all the possible alternative explanations for some phenomenon, right? But even so, we might think we have good reason in favor of the particular theory that we have. Well, I'll just say that. I can imagine some people might want to challenge that. All right. All right, I'm going to skip a paragraph there. Okay, having gotten our feet wet along the shores of deep metaphysical waters, let's now turn to what historically has been perhaps the most fundamental objection to this philosophical project of seeking a satisfactory explanation schema for contingent existence. It takes the form of a dilemma. So the argument goes like this. Either we implausibly embrace possibility collapse and suppose that in the final necessity, in the final analysis, nothing is contingent, all is necessity. That's what Spinoza thought, or it seems, in a more complicated way, what Leibniz ends up with. Or the thought is either you go that route, and that's rather implausible. That little scuff mark had to be exactly the way it was at just that moment in time. It's hard to credit. It seems like we can imagine ever so many other possibilities. Or we have to concede the existence of brute, that is, wholly inexplicable contingency somewhere or other in our picture of reality, and thereby have to give up on the possibility of complete or ultimate explanation. Okay? The claim is you're going to have to go one of these two routes. So what you're not going to get is complete explanation of contingent reality. The objector reasons as follows. If there truly is a sufficient reason for every truth, a reason why it is so and not otherwise, then every truth will be a necessary truth, because it will be a direct consequence of the fully explicable and hence necessary activity or choice of a necessary being. So the operative principle here is that whatever is a necessary consequence of a necessary being is itself necessary, right? Derivatively necessary. If not, if there is at some point a merely contingent connection between this hypothesized necessary being and contingent reality, so that this contingent world might not have existed even given the existence and nature of the necessary being, then we've after all conceded that some contingent truths are brute truths. The fact that it happened to bring about that contingent reality, lacking complete explanation. And if we have some brute truths, why not just let contingent existence itself be one such fact? So now we've undercut the motivation for postulating the necessary being, since we've ended up with some unexplained contingency anyways, right? So best stick to what we observe. So as a philosophical argument for theism, we might have other arguments, but as a philosophical argument, it's dead in the water. That's the thought. All right, the problem with this dilemma-style argument is that it falsely assumes that any complete explanation of some state of affairs is necessarily and fully contrastive, explaining why that state of affairs obtains rather than any possible alternative. Right? So the thought is, Leibniz would very much embrace this with his principle of sufficient reason. If I start off asking, why X? Why is Ted sitting here? Right? Leibniz and many other people would say, if you're really going to explain that, why Ted is sitting here right now, you're going to explain why Ted is sitting here right now rather than any possible alternative that we could imagine. Ted sitting over there, Ted's, getting bored and deciding to enjoy the sunshine at some point, or just not bothering to show up this morning, just sleeping in, or, so the thought is, and if you don't explain why those alternatives did not obtain, then you haven't really explained why what's actually happened. You haven't really explained X. So if you're going to explain X, you got to explain why X rather than Y for any possible Y. Okay? And you can see the necessitarian implications of that idea. It sounds like all explanations can have to be deterministic. It's going to have to rule out all alternatives. I'm going to claim that it's false to say that the only way to explain something requires this type of explanation, a contrastive explanation. So let me try to persuade you that we can have complete explanation that is not fully contrastive. Whatever the empirical details turn out to be, contingent reality is comprised of the total set of basic contingent individuals, right? Maybe their electrons are among the basic individuals, maybe not. Maybe persons are in some sense among the most basic individuals, even though we're composed individuals. Won't explore that idea now, but reality is comprised of the total set of basic contingent individuals and their histories, everything that's happened to them throughout their existence. And sum total of all that, that's contingent reality. Where an individual's history consists in the properties that it exhibits and the relationships it enters into at each moment of its existence. A basic or minimum grade, you might say, form of causal explanation seeks to explain either an individual's coming to be or its coming to have or maintain certain properties, or several individuals coming to be related in a certain manner. This is what philosophers do. We think in very abstract terms. Okay? Such explanation, again, I have no helpful picture for this abstract idea. Such explanation consists in giving information concerning the causal or dispositional nature of the target's causes. So when you're explaining something like, why is this thing exhibiting this property right now? Why is there a lectern right now standing here that has certain structural properties and so forth? You're going to point to some kind of cause or set of causes that have certain characteristics capable of generating something like this state of affairs. Okay, so you talk in terms of the causes, what you might say causal profile. It's set of causal capacities or dispositions, and say it operated in a given context and generated what it is you're looking to explain. And that would be a causal explanation for how this came to be. Here, probably some kind of machine manufactured the various components, they're put together in some kind of factory and so forth. That would be a causal explanation. Importantly, the causal profile of whatever caused what you're trying to explain might involve deterministic or merely probabilistic tendencies relative to a specific type of circumstance. Okay? With so-called probabilistic causes, the probability measures the objective likelihood that a given set of causal factors will bring about a potential effect. All right, so maybe we've got some fundamental physical system that is capable, given everything that's brought to bear on the system, there's not just one unique outcome guaranteed, right? It's got the potential to go in one of three different directions. Let's call them A, B, or C, okay? And let's suppose that they're not equally weighted. There's a bias towards A, 60% probability for A, 20% B, 20% C, okay? And let's suppose on a given occasion B occurs, right? The B outcome. And then you say, why B? And the answer will be, well, we have this cause. It has a certain kind of structure, a certain kind of causal profile. You describe it. If you're a physicist, not a metaphysician, you actually describe the details of the thing, right? How it works, and you say it was capable of yielding that outcome, and in fact, it did so on this occasion. That's the thing that brought that outcome about. Well, that's an explanation, right? You really have explained why it happened. But now, if you ask, yeah, but okay, given what you've told me, A or C were possible too. In fact, A was 3 times as likely as B in this situation. Why B rather than A? And the answer will be, there's no explanation for that. Come back to that, right? But I have explained to you what actually happened. there is an explanation for B. Even physicists sometimes talk in ways that I think are just really confused. They'll say, you know, if quantum mechanics under our best theory of the fundamental structure of reality. I was imagining John Polkinghorne being here and being rather nervous talking about all this. So maybe it was rather fortuitous. I hope he's well, but you know. Sometimes physicists, I don't think he's one of them, talk as if, well, because of the indeterministic character of the way quantum mechanical systems evolve, at least on standard interpretations of quantum mechanics, there really is no explanation for anything that happens. Nothing, right? There's only explanations for patterns of distributions of outcomes over many, many trials. Right? We can explain why, if you were to put this system into operation many, many, many times, the distribution of outcomes would converge towards 60% of them being of type A, 20% B, 20% C. But no explanation whatsoever of the particular outcome on any given occasion. I think this is just a totally confused way of thinking, right? There is an explanation. There's a causal mechanism operative. What there isn't is a contrastive explanation, right? But that's not to say that what happens is just unexplained, totally without an explanation, right? What kind of theory would tell you that, right? That's not a theory. That's giving up on a theory. I think it's just a confused way of thinking about the nature of explanation. So what we should say is that the system has propensities towards a plurality of possible effects. And these propensities are sufficient for each of the possible effects in the sense that they are all that is needed, though not in the sense that they are a causally sufficient condition, one whose presence guarantees a particular outcome. Every indeterministic event is produced by some cause or other, though none is necessitated. So, if what I've just said is right, when we seek an explanation of the existence of the universe or contingent reality as a whole, however large contingent reality as a whole turns out to be, minimum grade causal explanation is a permissible form. Of course, we might also seek explanations of more fine-grained truths concerning the universe, such as the fact that this reality obtains rather than a particular alternative. But that's to ask a different question. And it should not be assumed that potential explanations of these fine-grained contrastive facts will simply fall out of a viable explanation of the more basic kind, just an explanation of what exists, right? The concrete, actual reality itself. Bearing all this in mind, I suggest that the following explanatory principle is a plausible one. And since there's a Roman numeral 1, you can anticipate that there's probably a number 2 to follow. And this principle says, look, it's plausible to think this. The existence of every contingent individual and arbitrary collections thereof, and the occurrence of every concrete event in or among such individuals, have true minimum grade causal explanations. One example of a metaphysics that is consistent with the principle in its full generality, without entailing that all is necessity, is classical theism. Theism yields the following schematic explanation of the entire realm of contingently existing entities. One, this is, I think, maybe on your handout, but I didn't put this on a slide. The totality of such entities and their events that they undergo are the causal products of a divine act of will or choice that is guided by some goal or reason. And two, this totality was chosen despite the presence of either competing reasons to will a different outcome or the available of attractive alternative ways of achieving the very same goals that guided what was in fact willed. If this schematic explanation were correct, then the existence of every natural particular and the events in which they participate admit, in principle, of a fully adequate explanation in terms ultimately involving their causal dependency on a necessary being, whose activity was guided but not determined by some goals that the actual order of things was seen to satisfy. Which is to say, there is an account of why there is anything at all, and why the natural order has the character it has. And note further that by understanding schematically the purposive and free nature of the being on whom all possibilities and actualities would ultimately depend, we might see too why these dependent beings exist only contingently, we would see that it is the very nature of a freely choosing agent, whether human or divine, to bring about effects that are not necessitated and hence which are contingent. All right, my time's rapidly drawing to a close. I was going to make the same point just in terms of fundamental physical theory, right? That there too, you can have complete, at least locally complete explanation of a phenomena, even absent contrastive explanation. The contrast between an imagined brute, so let me say this. So one could imagine, someone like Hume says, our universe just is a brute fact. It just happens that there is a universe of this sort. There's no further deep explanation. It's contingent, didn't have to be this way, it just is. End of story. Okay? No explanation. All explanation gives out somewhere. That's where we should just stop. Okay? The alternative, one possible alternative is to say, no, our universe exists. It's not a brute fact. It was caused by a necessary being, a being whose very nature is to be, right? Who could not have been otherwise. So you can't ask the same kind of explanation. Yeah, but why it? It exists of necessity. That being caused our universe to be. That's that in very schematic form is the basis of the explanation of why the contingent reality exists. But that necessary being might have caused alternative realities, right? But it chose the one that it did. The contrast between these two cases is no less stark than it would be if the necessary being had to generate, that there was some kind of internal necessity that guaranteed that it was going to generate. The mere fact that it's operating in a non-deterministic fashion doesn't mean that somehow there's no explanation for what happened, right? Just say no to the claim that where there is no determinism, there can be no full explanation. Okay, I really need to move along here. So, no, let's go back here. So the second principle says, look, here's another way of thinking about the same point that I just made. You could say that for every contingent event or existence, or even any truth regarding such an entity, including contrastive facts, like that this universe existed rather than some other, either there's a true explanation of it, or there is a non-vacuously true explanation why it has no true explanation. Right? What do I mean by that? Right? So in the envisioned scenario where God causes contingent reality to be, but God might have caused other contingent realities to be, you say, why this? And you say God caused it for various purposes, perhaps unknown to us and unknowable to us, but in principle they're there to be had, maybe known only to God, right? That's why that. But then you say, why this? Okay, but here's something about our reality. It's contingent. It exists rather than these other possibilities God was contemplating. So why this rather than that? Answer, there is no explanation for that. And then you say, whoa, that sounds like you've checkmate, right? You've just conceded there's something that has no explanation. Yes, this fact about reality, that it's contingent, that there were alternatives to it, and that it was realized, is not explained, but there's an explanation why there is no explanation of it. Namely, the necessary being on whom all possibilities depend operates in a non-deterministic fashion. Thereby it guarantees no matter what it does, that there's not going to be that kind of contrastive explanation. So the lack of contrastive explanation is not just a brute fact. It's something that is intelligible once we understand the nature of the cause that's operative, right? That's what I want to claim. All right, I will be done in about 1 minute here. This went took more time than I thought, sorry. We are now in a position to see that certain ways of formulating the question regarding contingent existence that is to be answered make questionable assumptions about the form an explanation schema for existence must take. It's a mark of a philosophical discussion that after a long, hard slog, like what I've just put you through, we only at the end say, what question should we be asking to begin with here? Okay, we had to work really hard to get that's really the heart of what I'm trying to do here. it's commonly put this way: why is there anything at all? But this very general formulation admits, importantly, distinct ways of making it precise. So certain ways of asking the question that superficially sound the same are actually asking different questions. So you could ask, why are there contingent things? Okay, that's a question. Or you could ask the contrastive question, why are there these contingent things rather than there being nothing contingent at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? That's a contrastive question. Why do these contingent things exist? Why do these contingent things exist, right? The first one was, why are there contingent things in general? Second, why do these contingent things exist? Finally, why do these contingent things exist rather than those other apparently possible other ones that we can contemplate, right? All right, I suggest that the best formulation of the question is the one that's at the end of your handout. Appropriately, it's labeled the basic question. Are there contingently existing objects? And if there are, why do these particular contingent objects there are exist and undergo the events they do? Now, the reason I say we should prefer this way of formulating the question is that it presumes the least possible about what is there to be explained and what form a true explanation may turn out to have. So Spinoza questioned the common assumption that there are any contingent truths at all. I myself think there are decisive reasons for rejecting that view, but we shouldn't rule Spinoza out of court by the very way we ask the question. That's why I have the first clause of the question. Are there, right? We allow Spinoza to challenge the assumption that there are. The second half of the basic question sets a minimum bar for precluding brutally, that is, wholly inexplicable contingent existences or occurrences in reality. Okay? Some explanations that are consistent with the two principles of explanation I gave, but are not consistent with fully contrastive explanation, are quite fine and are no worse off than for that. Contingency rooted in indeterministic causes need not be brute, that is, wholly inexplicable. And last, is this the final answer, this book? Well, I doubt it, but I wrote a book on this subject in 2008, and there's a copy of it on the back table back over there, and I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim, for answering the question.
Yeah.
Posing it, so let's hand over the questions. Back over there.
Thank you, Tim. In the sort of the philosophical context, using the term metaphysics and metaphysical gives me a bit of anxiety, and the reason is this: that in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's analytical philosophy that holds sway, and these people are pretty sniffy about metaphysics. So, for example, I think, with all due respect, what is in the last hour wouldn't go down well, for example, in Oxford senior common rooms.
Okay, great. Great question. Yeah, it is true that, as you say, in the English-speaking world, philosophy in the 20th century was dominated by sort of a very empiricist, austerely empiricist outlook. In the heyday of logical positivism, a really austere form of empiricism. That basically said, look, all we should suppose there is our experiences, right? And we just systematize our experiences. There are just these phenomenal experiences, and even skepticism about the existence of a mind-independent world itself. Okay, right. And so anyway, this anti-metaphysical sort of outlook. Two things to say about in response to that. Well, fashions come and go, and I'm not much moved. As Plato said, we don't decide philosophical questions by counting noses. We don't do that any more in philosophy than we do in science. But second thing to say is, in the last 30, 40 years, metaphysics has made a comeback. And so now you go, the Wainfleet Professor of Metaphysics at Oxford and the Wykeham Professor of Logic at Oxford are two card-carrying, fully credentialed, unabashed metaphysicians. They're two of the most significant philosophers now writing. So times have changed, I'm happy to say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. I found that talk really, really illuminating because I've always felt instinctively deep down that I've got a lot in common with Spinoza, and I really, really like when Spinoza sort of says this necessity, and it's kind of a hard determinism. Well, it's kind of a hard determinism, if that makes sense. I've always maintained that the only proof that you need for something to have been the necessary, something that necessarily had to happen out of three causes is the fact that it did happen. Does that make sense? If there's three possible causes and we're trying to understand why A happened and not B and not C, then the only explanation we need to know is the fact that A did happen meant that B and C never could have happened because in this universe they didn't happen. The reason Ted sat there, he had absolutely no choice about it. From the moment just after the Big Bang, everything was determined that led up to the moment that he would sit here. We think he had a choice, but that only displays our ignorance of the variables involved. And that's been my position, I felt instinctively for a very long time. And would you say that proof that something is necessary and had to happen is the fact that it does happen? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I would deny that the mere fact that something did happen gives us reason to suppose that it had to happen.
How so?
Right. Well, the burden of proof is on the one making the very bold assertion there, and that's you. In this instance, that's what we do sometimes in philosophy. We play burden of proof tennis. It's like back to you.
But why did B and C not happen? Why is Ted sat here and not?
Maybe there's no explanation. I mean, right. I mean, Spinoza gives this nice image of, human beings, we think we have free will, but it's like, if a leaf falling from a tree mid-flight were to suddenly become conscious, it would think it's choosing, it could have, not realizing it's the source of its behavior or something. That's an open possibility, but that's certainly not the way we think about reality. So it's not our instinctual default. It seems to us that choices are open to us. Right. It seems like right now, as I'm contemplating answering you, I could grope for one or more different kind of ways of trying to respond. When I'm offered, when I go to the dinner table tonight, and I see there are these options, assuming now in some cases it might be just flat out obvious. I don't like that. So maybe in that case, it really wasn't in the cards that I was going to choose anything but that. But maybe they're both appealing to me, and I kind of hesitate, and I say, I'll go with this one. All right. It seems that way. Now that's not a proof that the seeming is veridical, right? But the question is, I think we would need anytime if our deep. I'm going to talk about this on Thursday morning, actually, at greater length, so I don't want to dwell too much on this. But if anytime, I think it's a fundamental way we have of thinking about human persons, both about ourselves and about others, that people are capable, at least ordinarily, right? People who are cognitively intact adult human beings, capable of making choices and aware of alternatives, aware often, usually, of the moral significance of many of those alternatives, and so we hold one another to account. And that presupposes that we have the capacity to have chosen differently, right? Now, and I think that's a default reasonable stance to take, absent compelling reason to think otherwise. Just like it's default reasonable for me to think my senses are operating properly, absent some compelling reason to think otherwise, because I can't argue for the reliability of my senses. I'd end up having to appeal to other outputs of my senses, right? And I don't know of any compelling reason to think that this kind of very strong determinism must be true. Now, one source might be, maybe this is what you're getting at, is someone think, but if there's to be explanation, things have to be determined. Otherwise, you're not really explaining. Leibniz thought that way, right? Leibniz is, one of his two foundational principles of his philosophy is the principle of sufficient reason. For every fact or existence whatsoever, there is some reason why it is so and not otherwise. right? So, but that just assumes, you know, that the only kind of real explanation is fully contrastive explanation, i.e. deterministic explanation. And I've been trying to suggest we could see how explanation could go even if determinism is not false. So that philosophical reason, saying the very nature of explanation demands that determinism be true, I think is just mistaken. Our fundamental physics doesn't assume that, right? At least on standard interpretations. Physicists have gotten quite comfortable with the idea that there can be causes of things that are not deterministic.
I really want to carry on with this conversation, but I think I'm better
Sorry.
go somewhere else.
The dinner one. Right at the very back next year.
Right, at one point in your lecture you mentioned a complementary approach to the fundamental question. I want to ask you if you understand this part of philosophy, i.e. metaphysics, as a way of answering this question through concepts in the way science does with values. And if so, how are these concepts equal or how are they complementing what we understand as values in science? How are these concepts reliable and relevant in the same complementary way of the scientific path?
Okay. I think I know what you're basically getting at there, but I'm just a little bit unsure about your use of the term scientific values. So perhaps, but I take it at the heart of your question is this. Look, we have reason to suppose science is pretty reliable. Mature sciences, they're at least converging towards truth. Why? Because they get better and better in their predictive efficacy, right? Theories become more powerful, get subsumed within theories that have wider and wider scope in physics, right? And we get a lot of empirical verification. And when we have a lot of beautiful ideas that are just proven wrong, and they have to be discarded, right? And we don't get this in metaphysics. There's going to be no empirical test that's going to decide between Spinoza and some non-necessitarian metaphysical hypothesis. And that, of course, is true. We don't get that in metaphysics. Does that show that metaphysics is bunk or worthless, or at any rate not something that we could have good reason particular metaphysical theories, we could have no good reason for endorsing them? I don't think so. I don't think it follows. The fact that we have a certain kind of confirmation in science doesn't mean that's the only way of having good justification, right? I don't want to say that what we get in, philosophers of old, the great and the heights of philosophical rationalism, wanted to say, well, look, you get proofs in philosophy. You get better than what you get in science. Science, you just get, more or less empirical evidence. But in metaphysics, you get proof, right? Leibniz would talk in terms of proofs, principles that are self-evident, and you can deduce things just like mathematics, right? Just like pure mathematics or something like that. Most philosophers don't talk that way anymore, and they do want to say it's a matter of weighing various considerations and what on balance seems likely to be true. But there can be factors that are not empirically testable that nonetheless have deep pull on us, and maybe I'm rambling a bit here, that do connect to the scientific enterprise, right? Because the scientific enterprise is animated by the desire to explain, to account for the phenomena we observe, and asking the question of existence is asking a question about something that's kind of the deepest explanatory question at all. And I do think we can consider what the range of possible alternatives, possible answers to that question might be. And though I didn't get into this here, I think you can actually engage, you could probe these alternatives. I do this in my book, whether successfully or not, but you can actually compare these competing metaphysical hypotheses and give reasons to favor one over the other, right? Some of them have problems in here when you try to probe, really work out what that view would be. And it seems to me it's arbitrary. There's a kind of arbitrariness to, on the one hand, being very tenacious, as we all are in everyday life, and as science is in a more rigorous, systematic way, of seeking explanations for any particular fact, and trying to trying to unify the set of facts, and then to stop at the most fundamental question itself, why this? And then say, well, there's no reason to think that question has an answer. That's a kind of arbitrary stopping point, right? I think we deeply assume that phenomena have explanations. Well, we should suppose that it's so that it's impossible for there to be an explanation for that most general fact. And some philosophers have thought that we can do that. I have tried to argue that and say the question is badly posed or something like that, but I think they're just mistaken about all that. I think in contemporary metaphysics, people recognize that some of these familiar philosophical objections are not compelling. Answer. So that.
Sorry about the feedback.
Thank you.
We're having, we're still working on them.
I think my question actually just carries on straight from there, which is you'd asked, are there contingent things? And I was wondering, if you're not looking for any empirical answer, how do you even answer that metaphysically from within the fishbowl, as it were? I mean, because we're kind of stuck in where we are. We can't see all the different possibilities. All we know is where we are.
Right.
So how do you judge between them?
Yeah. So between the idea that all is necessity versus this is contingent. So if you follow Spinoza and you say that necessity is immanent to reality, all is necessity, then you got to go. I won't talk about the particular details of Spinoza's view because I think it's irremediably obscure, his basic idea. So I'm going to talk about a broadly Spinozistic approach, which is just saying that in some sense necessity is immanent to physical reality. And you've got to go one of two ways. Either you say the totality is a necessary being just as a totality, or each of its parts, components, are individually necessary beings, right? And that's how totality, it's just okay? And so you got to go one of those two ways, right? If you say the totality is necessary but not the individual components, right, then you're not getting real necessity for the totality, right? Because necessity can't just pop out of a lot of contingent things as a whole. So I think really, and so this is contrary to Spinoza's own way of doing it, I think really taking this seriously, you got to say each and every elementary component is intrinsically a necessary being. It has the properties that it has intrinsically. But if you end up saying that, right, then I think the idea that there's causal connectedness among these these components vanishes, right? If everything exists of necessity, every little component, every bit of space-time, every location, every entity located in space-time is a necessary being, then the reason this thing is here is not because of some antecedent. So what I would say to Spinoza is that version of a Spinozistic view, the whole idea of causal connectedness of reality breaks down. And you might say, well, maybe we should suppose that. But if causal connectedness breaks down, then the very idea that if I'm speaking as Spinoza, giving an argument or stating the thesis of Spinozism, right, presupposes that an active communication that is a causal, so there's a kind of pragmatic inconsistency here in that view, right? Because it's so fundamental to our view, you have to just, rationality breaks down. Okay, the very idea of arguments, which are discrete, bits of discourse that have caused, one idea fall, and it's impacting your ears and so forth. So I think it kind of implodes, ultimately. So you can't go that way, I think. I mean, that's a very quick summary, but so that's just gives you a small idea of, you can argue about these alternatives. You can pose problems for them. Sure.
I rather get the feeling you're trying to rationalize error, and that
Rationalize
is error. I mean, it's like you put something up on the blackboard and it doesn't make sense, and you're saying, well, there must be a reason for it, and The only analogy I can think of is like taking Beethoven along to a performance of Beethoven's Ninth by the Topeka Barbershops Choir, and then saying to him, well, what do you think? And he says, I'm sorry, I don't think anything at all. This is not the way I conceived things to be. Don't ask me about it, because it's not within the framework that I conceive creation to be. So basically what you're trying to do is saying, you've got a God, you've got a perfect creation, you've got a spiritual creation, and then all of a sudden you're saying, well, you've got these aberrations come along, explain them. And I don't think that you can do that, because what you're trying to do is rationalize about something that shouldn't be there in the first place.
Well, what is there in the first place to begin with, if we're not assuming kind of religious picture of reality is just this, right? That's there in the first place. And we try to understand this, right? And science tries to describe it in detail, okay? And then we find out that there's a kind of intrinsic limit to how far science could go. I'm a big champion. I love theoretical physics. I know it makes some physicists rather nervous. They say it's getting anti-empirical. I'm good. I love the fact that cosmology is getting a little bit continuous with metaphysics here. I think it's great, because it just shows the impulse to try to drive explanation as far as we can get. And I'm totally on board with that as a philosopher. So then it turns out there's an intrinsic limit to how far science could go. It can't answer the fundamental question of existence of whatever turns out to be fundamental reality itself. It can't scientifically answer that, right? It could postulate, but then you're going philosophical, that it's a necessary being or something like that, okay? But we still have the question, right? And so then we bandy about for alternatives. So I'm not seeing, rationalizing error. This isn't error. This is reality, right? It's just simply it's given to us, and we're trying to understand why it is here, right?
Okay, so
and at some point we got to go metaphysical if we want this kind of ultimate explanation or complete explanation. Consider the alternatives. If you're a theist, right, you're going to think, in fact, I think it can be argued that you ought to think that God exists of necessity. Because if God doesn't exist of necessity, then it would make sense for God to say, to so to speak, think to himself, I'm glad that I exist. I might not have existed. And that seems to me the kind of thought that God should not be capable of having, right? So there's something inherent in the very idea of theism, that God is a necessary being, right? It's not just that God isn't caused to be by something else, but that God's existence is not gratuitous, it's not just a chance occurrence, right? Okay, so now we say, okay, so if you're a theist, perhaps on independent grounds. So I mean, maybe you're not liking the whole enterprise. Suppose you're a theist on independent grounds, and you're saying, what should I think about this weird metaphysical discourse about necessary being? Well, you ought to think God is a necessary being, and you ought to think God is the source of contingent reality. And then you're left with the question, yeah, but did God have to do things this way? Might he have done things otherwise? What would be the implications of going one way rather than the other, right? And now you're playing the game that I'm playing. And so where's the error popped in?
Well, again, the problem is it's not something you do in mathematics. If you've got a proposition, if you've got a principle on the blackboard, you're trying to solve an equation, you come up with the wrong answer. You don't say, well, why did I come up with the wrong answer? You just don't. You go back and you work out what the right answer is. And the problem I have with what appears to be so-called human existence, you have a large number of aberrations in there where you try to say, well, why is it that someone becomes an alcoholic if life is no use at all? But what good does it do you what good does it do you to try and rationalize something that doesn't have any benefit?
Okay, let me just say this briefly. Right, explanation doesn't have to be explanation in terms of meaning or purpose or significance. So someone could engage in the enterprise of asking about the possible sorts of explanation or explanation schemas that might be correct about why this exists without supposing that it provides meaning for individual occurrences, whether tragic or triumphant, right? So I wasn't, when I'm talking about explanation, we're not assuming that it imbues every individual human or other sentient being's event in their life with some kind of cosmic meaning. So I wasn't presupposing that at all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yesterday, Nidal mentioned a view held by some Muslims that God recreates the world in every instance. So there you have a necessary God as the sort of proximate cause in every moment. I wonder if you could comment on that viewpoint and how it fits with what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's inherent. Whether to call it recreation is a little controversial, but I think it's inherent in a theistic view of the world as opposed to a deistic view of the world, that God doesn't just sort of provide a spark, cause the universe to begin to be, and then the universe persists on its own steam, but that God sustains reality moment to moment. Such that if God were not actively to will the universe at a given moment in time, it would simply vanish, right? The universe does not, on a traditional theistic view, the universe does not have the capacity. It's inherently a dependent being, right? And that's not just a dependency of origin. That's a dependency of existence moment to moment.
But doesn't that remove free will just as much as Spinoza does?
Good. No, I don't. God can. Well, this is a very difficult, tricky question. I can't answer that in a satisfactory way. Very briefly, but I'll just want to say this: God can sustain the fundamental entities and their capacities in existence without determining the details of how they exercise their capacities once sustained, right? So God sustains things, as Aquinas would say, in accordance with their natures. If it's the nature of you and me to, on occasion, make free choices, then God sustains us in such a way that we retain that capacity to do that. So for God sustaining the universe moment to moment doesn't mean that God has to be determining the details of what happens moment to moment. That's the assertion. How that could be is something philosophers have debated a lot about, whether conservation collapses into total recreation moment to moment. I would reject the idea that the idea that God conserves the universe in existence moment to moment, sustains it, conserves it, just means that God recreates it in all its detail. Because if you did do that, then I think you'd be right. Then we'd be saying that God is a full cause of everything that happens, including every human act of choice. And but I don't think we have to say that.